I'm conducting research about student employment as part of the requirements for my Sociological Research Methods class, Sociology 300. I agree to keep your responses confidential. I will dispose of the tape after this class is completed. You can skip any question or end the interview at any time. If you have any questions about the research project, you can contact my professor. Here's his contact information.
You don't have to. I can just get that later. It's fine.
All right, let's begin.
I like the dispose of this tape. Definitely up to that language. We can.
All right, so in your own words, can you try your best to describe what graffiti writing is?
I mean, graffiti writing is specifically graffiti or specifically just graffiti writing, because those are two different things as far as I'm aware.
Either one.
Well, graffiti is any tag, any drawing on a public wall that is not really supposed to be there, and then the writing then is the stylized signatures or stylized marks by an individual, which is actually writing in the style of graffiti. That's what graffiti writing is. It's the art style of graffiti used as an expression of an individual's identity or mark or signature on a wall.
So in your own words, what do you consider to be art?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, that can be really simple or really complicated. Art can be anything that an individual creates that they consider to be art. So you could look at it from the perspective of the individual. The obvious corollary there is you could also look at it from the perspective of the group, the society. So you can take art as the opinion of the individual, art as the opinion of the society. From the perspective of the society, art is anything that society deems to be art, to have creative or aesthetic merit. So then the sum total definition of art would be anything that the individual or the society values as having creative merit, aesthetic merit, entertaining merit, anything that an individual creates for the purposes of being artistic as determined by society or themselves, I guess.
Okay. Well, what city was your first experience seeing graffiti writing in person, and what were your initial thoughts?
Oh, shit, I grew up in Sacramento, so, immediately, but I'm not going to remember those. My first, you're not really a human being until, age 8 or 9, so I don't know if prior to that really counts. So it must have been, my first conscious, impressions of it must have been either, I moved from Sacramento to locally when I was 9 or 10ish. So it was either right before I moved or after. And I think I have some impression of riding on the bridge. I live by a river in Sacramento, in a suburb, directly adjacent to, but not immediately on, a highway that headed into Sacramento. And this highway went over a bridge, so as a substantial highway and a substantial bridge, there was graffiti on it. So that was probably my first encounter with it, and I didn't really, at that age I probably wouldn't have thought anything of it. I think my first opinion, really, of it was probably dependent upon what it was that I saw. I think I can remember my first impression of, graffiti art that I liked, which was some stylized writing or something, which I saw, who knows where. But it's that impression of writing as a stylized thing on an abandoned anything. I'm not a big fan of the tagging, public monuments sort of shit that happens, but I am on board with the tagging of for example, those two old abandoned towers that are over by the way, heading from Santa Rosa out towards Montgomery Village, over on prior to the fairgrounds. Maybe they're over there. Those twisting snakes are a pretty good example of something that is art and is graffiti. But I don't really know what my actual first impression was. I think I must have been too young.
Okay. Another question. What do you believe the majority of your friends think about graffiti writing?
Oh, they're all artists. They're probably big fans. Well, I don't know. It kind of depends on whether they feel it's a crime or not. I mean, it really depends on the graffiti, because you can't really lump it all together, because some graffiti is destructive. If you tag a bronze statue in the middle of town, that's a problem. If you tag an abandoned building off on the corner of it, that's not. And sure, in both cases, you're doing something quote-unquote illegal, and they should be one and the same. But really, they're not. So I think they probably pretty much more or less agree with me there in that regard. But again, they're all artists. So they're probably relatively fond of the artistic side of it.
Okay. And so what do you believe the majority of your family thinks about graffiti writing?
Well, my brother's a white boy with dreads who spends his whole life climbing, so he'd probably have a good opinion of graffiti regardless. It's the kind of guy he is. He's really not much about the whole idea of the rule of law, and that's fine. That's his deal. I'm not a big fan of the dreads, but they look good on him. But yeah, my parents probably do not think too much of it. My father's very much like upper middle class. He's a surgeon, so very much, right? Yeah, eye surgeon. Very much upper middle class, straight, white, adult male, the Jewish patriarch sort of idea. So I know for sure he's not a big fan of anything he views as defacing public property, and he probably views probably more significant amount of graffiti than I do, as a very negative thing. I would wager my mother pretty much agrees with him, but to a lesser extent. That kind of tends to be the way of things in most things. But
she's in law, right? Or
yeah, she was she was a character. She was a private investigator, like she was a PI, for several years. Little white girl walking around in the ghetto. She's a fucking monster. And then she was a public defender for a while. So she's had quite a bit more contact with the unsavory, the delinquents of the world than my father has. She wouldn't have quit. She would have kept working as a private eye or public defender, but my father couldn't take it. So that's kind of where their opinions land on the spectrum, really.
Okay. Who do you believe are the majority of graffiti writers? What would be their demographic?
The materials that you use for art are reflections of the segment of society in which you were raised. So the point I'm making there is that the people who are exposed to graffiti as something that people do at a young age, and the people who have access to only graffiti as an outlet for their creativity, are probably the people who are less wealthy, who are in urban areas with concentrated populations, or people whose culture reflects that. So what I'm talking about is you basically have three factors. You have either or all of people who don't have much money, people who grew up around it, or people whose culture encourages it. So that means you're primarily looking at people in cities, lower income. Although that's no longer like exclusively true, because it's become like a thing to do. Now there's people who like do graffiti as like stylized things. So you get rich white boys thinking they're hard